Epicureanism and Stoicism both arose in Athens in the 4th century BCE. They arose as reasonable responses to the geopolitical condition of that city. Athens had been, of course, the city-state, which was the capital of a tremendously rich and arrogant empire, apparently invincible, at least for the 2 generations that had held sway over the Eastern Mediterranean world, over the commerce of the Eastern Mediterranean world, and over much of the land and sea territory of it as well. Athens had become, in the course of its imperial sway, the center of philosophical speculation also. This began in 494, when the Persians destroyed the Athenian colony of Miletus on the Ionian coast, and most of the Meletians who could escape made their way to the mother city. But by 338 BCE, Athens had been twice defeated in major and consequence-laden conflicts. By 400 BC, after a 2-generation-long, exhausting war, generally known as the Peloponnesian War, Athens had been defeated by the rival city-state of Sparta, formerly its ally against the Persian Empire. Then, in 338 BCE, Athens and its allies had to admit defeat by the large and expanding kingdom of Macedonia, led by its hereditary king Philip II. Although Philip allowed Athens to retain its independence out of respect for its cultural preeminence, Athens had to accept a subordinate position vis-à-vis this new type of more powerful state. Philip's son Alexander the Great established an incredible empire in southeastern Europe, Western Asia, and northeastern Africa, which broke up after his death in the city of Babylon in 323 BCE. It broke up finally into 3 very large polyglot empires, and it was perfectly clear by the year 300 that the Athenian-sized city-state was clearly over. Its day was done. Now, when the Romans in time, and especially in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, brought the Eastern Mediterranean basin under their imperial control by defeating the kingdoms of the descendants of Alexander's generals, the Romans enthusiastically adopted both Epicureanism and Stoicism. Epicureanism was named for its founder, Epicurus, a prolific writer and an Athenian citizen of elevated social status. He was born in 341 BCE, 3 years before Athens' defeat by the Macedonians, and he died some 70 years later in 270. Epicurus' largest book was a discussion of nature, but happiness and ethical salvation were the primary concerns of the school he founded. Following the 5th century philosopher Democritus, Epicurus taught that the world is eternal and composed of atoms, which produce everything by their infinitely variable combinations. Each human being is so composed, and so we dissolve entirely after the death of the body. There is no afterlife for humans in any sense. Epicurus was not an atheist, though. He believed that there were gods, long-lived beings of such distant refinement that human lives could mean nothing to them, and to whom it was therefore obviously hopeless to pray, or to build temples, or to dedicate cities. Human happiness must be found, therefore, in this life. Now, to achieve it, Epicurus recommended withdrawal from public life. Plato would have been horrified, and Aristotle even more so. One should also withdraw from sexual involvement, from the desire for fame, which was generally thought in ancient society to be a rather lofty kind of goal, and from the desire for material goods, less lofty to be sure, though certainly quite a widespread desire. In such a condition of disciplined withdrawal, which he called ataraxia, Epicurus taught that one might find maximum pleasure and minimum pain. One might, but one might not, in which case he has little advice. Epicurus' elevated doctrines appealed to idealistic, cultivated men and women of a world ruled by frantically competitive tyrants. Epicurean societies were founded by many Hellenistic cities, and also in Roman cities that followed them. It's hard to tell whether a Greek-speaking city in the eastern part of the Roman Empire should be called Hellenistic or Roman. The Romans simply moved in and took over Hellenistic cities, and then copied that model of city life and expanded it throughout the western parts of their empire as well. The adherents of these Epicurean societies were cultivated men and women who treasured letters of advice from Epicurus himself, and these letters of advice were called epistolae. And the habit of writing epistles about matters of spiritual and philosophical import was a very old habit by the time the Apostle Paul took it up. So here, early Christianity plugs right into a pre-existing mode of communication The thought that Christianity owes much to Epicureanism would not commend itself to many teachers of Christian doctrine, but here is a kind of fact in terms of the medium which has carried a very different message. Media can carry very different messages indeed. Now, Epicurus himself came to be seen as almost a kind of savior. Orpheus, the highly mythical figure who was said to have achieved wonders with his music, was definitely seen as a savior figure, and Epicurus was also seen in that light, except by a more restrained, a more disciplined, a more understated kind of clientele. Now, it's no surprise that many Epicureans settled for a much less elevated, a much less ascetic version of the master's doctrine, and cultivated instead lives of refined intellectual and sensual pleasure, avoiding politics as far as possible. Not surprisingly, the degree of refinement could tend to decline, and eventually you had in the late Roman Empire, possibly in Hellenistic cities before Roman takeover, the kind of Epicureanism that is widespread in American vernacular English today. The luxury food and wine shop of Neiman Marcus is called the Epicure shop, and it is likely that Epicurus himself would have considered it somewhat over the top, and certainly not conducive to the kind of pleasure he proposed. One should appreciate magnificent food, but never get sated or gluttonous. One should appreciate magnificent wine, but never get drunk. One should, if possible, have no sex at all, and if that wasn't possible, then certainly restrain oneself and try not to beget children into this deeply disappointing world. That sense of Epicureanism has, of course, gone much further indeed, all to the point that Hugh Hefner claimed to be an Epicurean in his Playboy Philosophy, a truly remarkable collection of statements which the author, at least, thought deserved the title philosophy. Think what Epicurus would have thought. Epicurus wouldn't have thought that he would have thought because, of course, the physical death of the body is the death of the human person, and there is no immortality except perhaps in this kind of fame, which Epicurus himself would have eschewed. The leading Roman Epicurean thinker and writer was Lucretius, who was born in 99 BC and died in 55 BCE, traditionally in the very year that Virgil took on the toga virilis, that is, became a man and was able to vote at age 17. He lived, in other words, a much shorter life than many of our philosophers. I hope we're noticing what long lives were enjoyed by many of these philosophical figures, and which was most unusual, given the demographics and the general state of epidemiology of the ancient world, generally taken as a sign that philosophy was a good thing, that if you pursued philosophy, you could last on in this life much longer than those who succumbed to passion and who risked their spirits as well as their material existence in that fashion. Even though he died in his 40s, Lucretius wrote a very successful book. He wrote other things as well, but his most famous work, his central work, obviously, in terms of his plan, is a long didactic poem in 6 books called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. It devised a new philosophical vocabulary for the Latin language, a work which was to be completed by Lucretius' longer-lived contemporary Cicero, who lived for another 12 years, dying in 43 BCE. Lucretius and Cicero certainly could read Greek, and many of the most cultivated Romans could, but they desired to turn this philosophia thing into their own language as well, so it would be more accessible at least to the literate members of Roman society. What are we talking about? The upper 5%, the upper 7%, or maybe even in the extension, the happy times of the 1st or 2nd century AD, the 1st and 2nd century CE, maybe 10% of the population, which was already a considerable expansion from the kind of audience envisioned by any of the Greek philosophers before them. Lucretius repeats Epicurus' teachings. To some extent, he reinterprets them, particularly, I think, his scientific teachings. The theological teachings of Epicurus are certainly extended. Lucretius is very clearly an atheist, although he will entertain the notion that something called gods might well exist, but that is extremely uncertain, and they don't do us any good anyway. No, they sometimes, our understanding of them does us some harm. He was concerned very much with ethical doctrines, though. That was more important to him, I think, in a way, than his scientific discoveries. Discoveries, I mean, in the realm of logic and the application of logic to the body of scientific truth, which was inherited from Aristotle and others, and very little questioned. Lucretius appeals to the innate goodness of mortal human beings. who had been vitiated by ignorance and the savage atrocities of religion. His sense of these matters did not convince all of his numerous readers who admired the style of his work on the nature of things, if not its content. St. Augustine, for example, in The City of God, gives us no sign whatever of any philosophical influence of Lucretius, but many suspect that they spot Lucretius' style beneath the magnificent prose that Augustine summoned up for that work written for what was surviving of the pagan elite in the 5th century CE. A moderate Epicureanism very probably became, in the minds of various historians, the favorite philosophy of the Roman Empire's upper classes, even if only in a somewhat clandestine fashion. Epicureanism has never really been approved of by establishment states or establishment religions, but it has survived very well anyway. It had lots of medieval Christian adherents. Christian, perhaps we should put in single quotes. I think, for example, of the Franklin in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, a very pleasant man who lives very well, who is gracious to everybody, who is a master of hospitality. Everyone comes to his table. And he takes care to offend no one. And he has no particular ambitions in the political world, certainly none in the political world. He is an Epicurean to the core, even though he is going on a pilgrimage to the shrine of a saint at Canterbury, as all decent people do at one time or another. And I think we can see this kind of lifestyle wedded to a largely unstated disbelief in most of the structures of official religion as a continuing theme in Western thought. Many assume that it must have been very powerful among the Roman upper classes. We don't have as much evidence to prove this as we would like, but it is at least a very plausible suspicion. Lucretius remained favorite reading for gentlemen of the 18th century Enlightenment. His Latin poetry is really quite remarkable. And it became a sort of advanced school book and would continue to be read by many gentlemen returning to their country estates or their provincial cities as dealing with the problems of that age. And many of its tenets were revived by the utilitarian philosophers of the later 18th and the 19th centuries. And in a sense, Epicureanism lives on today, not simply in its more vulgar and sensually oriented forms. Stoicism rose as a critical response to Epicureanism and also to skepticism, another contemporary philosophical movement. The founder of Stoicism is a very different person from Epicurus. He was not an Athenian citizen, not particularly upper class. It's hard to identify him socially, really. He wasn't even a Greek. He came from a Phoenician colony on the island of Cyprus, the colony of Kitium. He was born probably in the year 320, just a few years after the death of Alexander the Great. In other words, some 20 years after Epicurus. He's a younger contemporary, and he consciously took on Epicurus in his teaching. His school, which is it's hard to say it's called a school exactly. Zeno refused to have a school. He went to the agora, to the public meeting place of the city of Athens, and he gathered there, and he gathered people around him, and he taught, particularly in a great public porch, a great public portico, which had famous mural paintings behind it. This was known as the Stoa Poikile, the painted Stoa, and from this favorite place of meeting, the Stoic school, insofar as it is a school, took its name. Zeno liked sort of unstructured dialogues in the style of Socrates, whom he admired personally. And he was constantly attacking the dominant schools of thought, Platonism, Aristotelianism, Epicureanism, and skepticism, by confronting them with moral and logical paradoxes. Although in his personal style, Zeno advocated a return to Socrates, he shared the Epicureans' assumption that reality was essentially material. This is, I think, one of the hardest points to grasp about Stoicism. Although it seems to be a very spiritual doctrine, a doctrine which emphasizes moral conditions and moral realities and moral duties, Zeno was convinced that nature was material. In that sense, he carried on some of the atomistic theory of Democritus. He did not adopt all of Democritus' theory of the constitution of matter, nor certainly the moral consequences which came out of Democritean atomistic thought, probably atheistic. But he did believe that reality was material, which makes Stoicism surprising. But we should remember, Zeno is a master of paradox. It's the philosophy of paradox. Some say that Among world religions, Christianity has accepted paradox with delight, has reveled in it more thoroughly than even Buddhism or Confucianism. If that is so, that may help explain why of all of these later Greek philosophies, Stoicism was the one most easily accepted by Christianity, even before it achieved legal recognition in the Roman Empire. Even though Zeno and his followers were convinced of the material constitution of reality, they were committed primarily to finding useful answers to the everyday moral problems of ordinary people. Instead of the elite Epicurean ataraxia, that elite ideal of disciplined withdrawal, the Stoics proposed the ideal of apatheia, the ancestor etymologically of apathy, but about as different from modern English apathy as you can get. Apatheia, it means freedom from pathos, freedom from suffering, but also the kind of suffering that is passion. The freedom from the passionate temperament and from passionate behavior. And the social consequences of apatheia were anything but modern English apathy. The Stoics insisted strongly on one's duty to one's community and one's fellow humans. Zeno wrote a Republic. It does not survive, but we have pretty good descriptions of it. It survives in fragments. It was a republic much more radical than Plato's, although certainly a great deal less original. It would be difficult to be more original in Plato's Republic, difficult to be even as original as that, and it would be difficult to be more radical as well, but Zeno was able to manage that one. In that visionary work, Zeno declared that all who recognize the spark of divine reason within themselves, the spark of divine and natural reason within themselves, must acknowledge the sway of natural virtue, a kind of virtue which everywhere obeys the dictates of universal justice. If enough people ever do that, then the human race may be able to advance to the government of a worldwide city-state, a cosmopolis, a polis of the cosmos, of the entire world, which would be ruled by natural law. Now, in such a polity, in such a cosmopolitan realm of justice, all men would be brothers, enjoying a form of civic happiness, free of convention, free of the divisions falsely introduced by such bad things as family bonds, schools and the loyalty thereto, temples dedicated to one or another god, law courts, military ambition, or money. So we have this remarkable image of a cosmopolitan society which is disinterested in most of the things that we tend to consider signs of cosmopolitan culture. It's a fascinating kind of ideal, which appealed, of course, very strongly to the Romans. Cicero is, I think, the most striking proponent of Stoicism in the world of Roman thought. He was born in 106 BCE and died in 43, assassinated by the agents of Antony as a consequence of one of the Roman civil wars. Cicero was himself an eclectic in philosophy. That is, he liked to pick philosophical beliefs from this, that, and the other school. He was very strongly attracted by skepticism until he realized what the moral consequences of skepticism had to be. And so he moved to Stoicism. And we know that when he was in his late 20s, he heard the lectures of a man named Antiochus of Ascalon at Athens, Antiochus of Ascalon, who was trying to restore the tradition of Stoicism in the first century BCE. And Cicero gave him serious hearing. Many Romans found Stoicism the most acceptable current Greek philosophy, at least partly because of its respect for disciplined military valor, and also for its sense of a worldwide law. The Romans were setting up a world state, and they rather liked the idea that what they might be doing was preparing for the cosmopolis, because the Romans were always concerned about the fundamental morality of their actions. You're aware, I assume, that the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire never fought an aggressive war. Every war those masters of warfare fought was declared a defensive action by the Roman Senate before it got underway. We can look at the Romans as among the most ruthless exploiters of military talent, but the Romans themselves were bothered by this image and wanted everything they did to be moral and just. And if, indeed, the results of the long-range goal of all of these wars in which much blood was shed, many slaves were captured, and much wealth was taken back to Rome, if the long-range goal of this was some philosophical ideal state, a cosmopolis which would be free of attachment to family bonds, schools, military ambition, law courts, and money, then this could stand as a fine justification for what the Romans were doing to set up this condition. Obviously, this kind of idea lies behind the Roman Christian ideal of the city of God and more modern ideas of one world government, which has certainly not come anywhere near a realization at this point. So Stoicism is still a fresh philosophy, at least as regards its greatest political recommendation, its greatest political prescription, the cosmopolis of Zeno's Republic. Cicero is an interesting man to be concerned about this. Socially, he was born and raised and came to fame somewhere between Epicurus's aristocratic background and Zeno's non-Greek and apparently middle-class at best origins. He was what was called a new man, a novus homo, meaning he was not a scion of the old Roman nobility. He was from a very fine family, from the Volscian tribe, southeast of Rome, the region of Campania. And his family claimed descent from the Volscian kings, which is entirely likely, but they were certainly not sprung from old Latin blood. Cicero's father was rich, though, and he paid for a very excellent education, which sent Cicero off to Athens and to Rhodes and to other places in the Eastern world. He came back a lawyer who rose to be consul, the chief executive of the Roman state. And he was especially interested in the Stoic conception of natural law, which several of his works transmitted to a medieval and modern Western thought. Seneca was a native of the patrician Roman colony of Cordoba in Spain, a colonist, a colonial to be sure, but from a colony very proud of its origins. It claimed to have been settled by patrician citizens, not simply by ordinary Roman citizens. He was born in 4 BCE, and he died in the year 65 of the Common Era, committing suicide in his bathtub in response to commands from the Emperor Nero to do so. Seneca, whose uncle was a very famous orator and lawyer, whose books about legally effective rhetoric continued to be read throughout the Middle Ages and even somewhat into the modern period, had the money, had the means, and had the ambition to come to the capital. And in Rome, he made for himself quite a reputation and quite a lot of money. Unfortunately, from the point of view of those who take Stoicism very seriously, Seneca made most of his money from tax speculation, indeed from lending money at staggering rates of interest on the expectation that the borrower would profit enough from tax futures to be able to pay Seneca back. And he may in fact have had a hand in this indirect way in the tragic rebellion of the British Queen Boudica against the Roman occupation of Britain under the reign of the Emperor Claudius. Seneca had got appointed tutor to the young man who would become the Emperor Nero, and he tutored him in philosophy and taught him Greek very well. He probably taught him the use of the Greek language for highfalutin kind of statements. But he did not succeed very much in teaching the Emperor Nero how to be a Stoic, to put it mildly. He wrote a great deal. He wrote a lot of prose treatises of a philosophical character, treatises that were disguised as formal letters to a friend, but they would grow and grow into what they really were, which was a treatise on some subject such as clemency, or tranquility, or how to endure misfortune in a cruel world. And he also composed dramas, not so much for presentation on stage, but for recitation. It's not at all clear that any of his dramas were actually ever performed on stage until the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance period. You may remember that Hamlet is very much in favor of various of Seneca's plays, and that clearly became part of the theatrical side of Renaissance education. But these may have been intended entirely to be read by elevated types in their salons, rather than put on stage by vulgar types such as actors. Now, both types of work, the dramas and the letters, circulated throughout the empire in Seneca's lifetime even, and remained favorite items of school reading for 18 centuries. As his pupil Nero turned against his advice, Seneca stoically endured the danger of not going along with his pupil's preferences, and then committed suicide with dignity, an entirely honorable thing to do in the ancient world, and particularly within the orbit of Stoic thought. Probably the most impressive of the Roman Stoics, at least in terms of rank, is the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was born about 120 CE, and he died in the year 180, apparently one of the first victims of the bubonic plague, which had just come out of India and was beginning to ravage Europe. The bubonic plague, known in its later medieval reappearance in the 14th century as the Black Death, was a terrifying disease, which did at least polish off its victims within just a few days. And we are told that Marcus Aurelius met his end stoically. In fact, he did everything stoically, as far as we can tell. He was trained as a young man to be a kind of philosopher king in Plato's kind of style, ruling over something very like a cosmopolis. And one can see that he had the thought that it would be good for rulers like himself to turn the Roman Empire into a genuinely Stoic cosmopolis. Unfortunately, reality meant that he had to spend almost all of his 14-year reign — he was emperor from 166 to 180 — on the river Danube, campaigning against the incursions of Germans with attractive and civilized names like Quadi and Marcomanni, and he did so successfully that the Quadi and the Marcomanni disappeared from history after his reign. He died, in fact, very near the modern city of Vienna, at the Roman military camp of Vindobona on the Danube, which lies today in sort of the northern suburbs of that later imperial city. We know most about Marcus Aurelius because of his book of personal reflections, his book called the Meditations, which some see as the first autobiography. Most think that it isn't really an autobiography. Marcus Aurelius, at the end of a tough day, would come back to his tent and write down his thoughts about this or that moral problem, this or that general issue, very rarely relating it to his own experience that day or indeed in his lifetime. The Meditations are a series of reflections on general issues written by a particular man who preferred to find validation in general principles rather than in individual privileges. And since this man was the most powerful ruler in the known world, the world known to West Europeans and West Asians and North Africans, that was a pretty impressive kind of commitment, it seems to me. I suppose the most striking message that one gets from the Meditations is its sense of unflinching adherence to private and public virtue, which is the only form of real happiness. Virtue is its own reward for Marcus Aurelius, as indeed for the entire Stoic tradition. Rarely has it been more powerfully stated by a man of anything like comparable power. Although it was composed in Greek, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius have been read in Latin and the translations into modern languages ever since they were composed. And they enjoyed special favor among 18th and 19th century European gentlemen who were struggling with the demands of imperial rule. Many an English product of a public school, or perhaps of Oxford or Cambridge, who was out in India or in the British West Indies trying to rule an empire justly and to rule it at all, took great comfort in reading the Meditations. It's very short, and one can read short passages just as they were composed, a short burst at a time, being sure that one's Greek, or if one's Greek was fading, that one's English translation side by side on facing pages was still up to the job. Some think that Epicureanism appealed to most upper-class Romans of any kind of philosophical inclinations, but they often didn't want to admit this. But we have to recognize that Stoicism was by far the most publicly favored philosophical school. On the basis of the surviving written evidence, we would have to say that Stoicism was the most widespread Greek philosophy of any kind among the rulers of the Roman Empire, or the citizens who benefited from the Roman Empire, its rulers or its beneficiaries. It was also remarkably egalitarian, which is kind of a surprise, since the Roman Empire was a very good deal for the top 5% of the population. And the clearest evidence of this, I guess, is the career of the Phrygian slave Epictetus, born about 55 CE, dying apparently in 135, who became a respected teacher of Stoic ethics. Freed by his master, he moved to Rome, where his teachings were so popular that someone put together an anthology of his lectures called the Manual. And the Manual tremendously influenced the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, from slave to emperor, by means of manumission and the composition, not the composition, the delivery of lectures, which were then written down and composed by his faithful students. Epictetus believed that the only things in our power are our will and our body. Our will is always free, and we must keep both it and our body untainted And in that way, we will avoid pain, which is merely external to us.